Well, the issue of an internet sales tax has reared up again, and in fact, the U.S. Congress and many states are looking at this issue. And that's our topic this week on The Communicators. Now, we want to start off by talking with the chairman of the California State Board of Equalization, Jerome Horton. Mr. Horton, California has recently changed how it manages or its taxation policies when it comes to the internet, hasn't it?
Yes, Peter, it has. It broadened the definition of what's taxable in California to include online retailers who meet certain criteria.
Now, you said you've broadened. How was it before, and now who is included?
Prior to the law, the sales tax didn't apply to companies that had affiliates and worked through various different groups here in the state of California. The law broadened the definition of who actually qualifies to include those individuals. So now online retailers who have affiliates in the state of California, who also have some form of brick and mortar, either directly or indirectly working through other groups and partnerships and so forth, have nexus in California by the definition of California law, and therefore required to collect and report the use tax to the state of California. Companies that are now included would include Amazon, Best Buy, and Walmart, that are making sales online. There are other criteria that you have to make $1 million, I believe, in total revenue and $10,000 a year to California consumers, or something along those lines.
Now, Mr. Horton, how much in revenue does the state of California expect to generate through this new taxation policy, and what's the rate of taxation?
Peter, the rate varies depending on the destination where the product is delivered, but it's somewhere around 9.75%. The total revenue that the state of California anticipated that it was losing was $1.4 billion. We believe that this new law will allow us to generate additional $317 million a year, of which approximately $83 million is attributed to Amazon alone.
Now, 9.75%, is that the same as the state sales tax?
The tax rate is exactly the same as the state sales tax. It varies. The total rate varies because we have in California a destination tax, so it depends on where the product is actually delivered, and there are other transit taxes and Bradley Burns taxes that are included in the overall rate.
Jerome Horton is chairman of the California State Board of Equalization. Thank you for giving us an update on what's happening in California. Now, we want to introduce you to a couple more folks talking about this issue. First, Steve Del Bianco of a group called NetChoice, and Joe Crosby with the Retail Industry Leaders Association. Gentlemen, Mr. Del Bianco, if we could start with you. What is your group and what's its position when it comes to this internet sales tax?
Yeah, NetChoice is a coalition of e-commerce companies and online platforms. And our position is, it's similar to what you might hear. You do a lot of book author interviews, and if you had the authors of our Constitution in here today, they'd have said they were really worried 225 years ago about the colonies erecting tariffs and trade barriers to protect their own businesses. So Article 1 in the U.S. Constitution says that the states can't regulate interstate commerce. Only Congress can. So our position, California has decided to get aggressive at determining who has presence in California, but that's in keeping with this constitutional provision. California is simply saying that if you have presence here through some interesting definitions, you've got to collect for California. So it really doesn't interfere with interstate commerce, because they're considering anyone who has an affiliate there or a partnership in California to already be a California company.
So two things. Name a group that's, name a corporation that's a member of NetChoice, and are you supportive of what California has done?
Oh, our members are folks like eBay, PayPal, Overstock, Facebook, companies that
Amazon?
do commerce. Amazon's not.
Okay.
But companies that have platforms for e-commerce that enable a lot of other businesses to get online as well. And our position is that California is probably taken too aggressive a step at asserting that you have presence in California simply because you paid for an advertisement there. But I'm gratified to see that California set a very, very reasonably high small seller exception. And they have to do $1 million a year in California and $10,000 a year through these partnerships and affiliates. And at that level of small seller exception, I think that's a pretty appropriate one of insulating the small firms from burdens they could never afford to bear.
Joe Crosby is with the Retail Industry Leaders Association. Mr. Crosby, what's your group's position on an internet sales tax?
Thank you, Peter. The Retail Industry Leaders Association represents retailers across the board, including some of the larger retailers in the country and in the world. And they're interested in seeing, after 20 years of discussion and debate, a level playing field created, as Steve says, through Congress. The Congress ultimately has the authority to regulate interstate commerce, and we think it's appropriate with some of the legislation that's out there and some of the simplifications included in those legislations to make it so that all retailers above a certain threshold can collect taxes in all the states and where taxes are legally due.
So, Mr. Crosby, what California did, is that simplification in your view, and do you support it?
Well, California, certainly Realist supports the activities that California has undertaken. And I think the important thing to understand is California, as Steve said, is doing everything it can under the limitations that the Supreme Court has placed upon the states. Ultimately, congressional interaction is necessary, intervention is necessary to ensure that retail is treated similarly across the board, so that anyone who is selling is collecting tax where the tax is owed and doing so in a way that they can do easily enough with whatever simplifications Congress might impose.
And we want to introduce you to one more member of our panel, and this is Kara Griffith with State Tax Notes. She is the legal editor and our guest reporter.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you both and to get your thoughts on this. As you both mentioned, we've got several bills that are pending before Congress, and it seems as though we need some sort of federal intervention to kind of get this issue taken care of. Are we going to see movement on any of the bills that are currently pending?
That's a great question. I mean, it is a foolhardy thing to predict congressional action, especially when they're out now and will be coming back presumably after the elections for a relatively short period of time. We're certainly optimistic, though. We're working very hard. There's a lot of interest, as you know. This year has been unprecedented in terms of the attention that Congress has given to this and other state tax issues. So we're continuing to work diligently on it and are hopeful that when Congress resumes its work, that there'll be an opportunity to move this forward, one of the various bills that is out there.
Yeah, Kara, there has been movement, as you know, and I testified in each of the last two hearings on these bills. And I think that movement is constructive because it's focusing on Congress's role at protecting interstate commerce and Congress trying to take seriously what kind of minimum simplifications they can require before they allow states to export their tax collection burdens on businesses that aren't even having a presence in those states. So that's a conversation I am glad that we're having. And we're having an opportunity to talk about multiple rates per state. There's still 9,600 different rates, and the states haven't all agreed for a single filing form or a single audit. So I think we're on the right track to have that conversation, but will it happen in 2012? I doubt it.
Now, in terms of the simplification that we need, what are your thoughts? Are one of the bills better than another? Are there things that Congress should focus on that they haven't yet?
The legislation differs in the kind of minimum simplifications, the quid pro quo it puts on the states in order to let them export their tax collections. They all include the notion that the states have to provide some sort of software. But you see, it's not enough to have software that just looks up a rate for a given home address. Software has also got to do electronic filing for all the states in a standardized form, automatic remittance to every state. And looking beyond software, there has to be compensation for vendors. Software installation is expensive. Handling questions from customers in 46 different states and handling audits is going to be expensive for business. They're going to need some compensation. We're going to need to streamline the rates and definitions. These bills don't even require every state to have the same definition for items that are taxable.
Now, in terms of providing software and things, I mean, where are the states going to come up with the money to do this? We've had such a difficult period of budgetary concerns. Is that going to play a factor?
Well, they claim that they'll pay for that out of the new revenue that's brought in. And Joe and I have both been engaged with the Streamline sales tax project for over a decade, Joe even longer. And Streamline has several software vendors who've agreed to develop and certify and deploy software as long as they get to keep a piece of the action, a piece of the sales tax that's collected. And they don't always do all the integration that the vendors and retailers and small businesses of America need. And that's where some more congressional leadership is going to be needed.
And I think these things can definitely be worked out. For me, it's exciting that after almost 15 years of working on this, sitting next to Steve here, that we're not talking about whether this should be done, but how it should be done. And I think that shows how the debate has evolved over those 15 years, and it's been going on for much longer than that, that I think there's a general recognition now that there's no principled reason, either legally or economically, that sales taxes should not be collected when on remote sales. It's simply a question of how should they happen. And with regard to the simplifications, the bills do vary somewhat. And in fact, they vary from bills that have been out there previously. And I think it reflects Congress's normal balancing of the needs of interstate commerce versus the sovereignty rights of the states. And the Supreme Court has stepped in here, as you know, and said, well, here is the line, but it's up to Congress ultimately to determine where the line should be placed. And I think that's what they're doing right now in the discussion that's being engaged on at Capitol Hill is what is the right balance? What is the right balance to ensure that the playing field is level for all sellers, while not unduly burdening sellers that don't have a physical presence in a state, or putting too much of a burden on smaller sellers? And what does that really mean? And so I think all those things are going on right now. And as Steve, I agree with Steve that this is moving forward in a productive way. And again, hopeful that we'll get some activity soon.
But Mr. Crosby, if you represent, let's say, a Macy's or a Walmart in your group in the Retail Industry Leaders Association, they sell online plus brick and mortar.
Right.
So where's the lost revenue for them? Is there lost revenue for them?
The revenue is the state's revenue. So the retailers are simply collecting it on behalf of the states.
But one of the arguments that brick and mortar stores have made is that we lose revenue because it's cheaper to buy online.
If you look at top line revenue, just the competitive advantage that a seller that's not required to collect tax has. Jerome Horton was just talking about the rate on average in California is about 9.75%. So you have that rate differential. Now, of course, the consumer has a legal responsibility to remit taxes where they're not collected from by the retailer, so the so-called use tax, but very few folks do that. And so for most consumers, and you saw the news reports in California as this was being played out, buy now, this is your last tax-free shopping day. That's not entirely accurate. It wasn't tax-free, but it wasn't going to be collected from the seller, and then you're up to your own, you and the man in the mirror to determine whether that is going to be paid or not.
The notion of fairness, though. Fair is when everyone plays by the same rules. And today, that's exactly what happens. Every business, online or offline, collects and files sales tax for every place that has a physical presence. So every online company collects and files in states where they have stores, and every Main Street store collects in the state where they're located. This is a move to let states force businesses who don't have a presence in their state to collect. And that really shifts a disproportionate burden on those, we call them remote retailers, folks that are out of state. In California, I know that Mr. Horton told us that part of his law was to capture Walmart.com and Target.com, but they already collect in California because they have stores in California. They have a physical presence that's integrated with their websites. What's new is that Amazon began collecting a week ago in California, and Amazon, as Mr. Horton said, is a big part of their expected revenue. So if, in fact, the fairness argument and the level playing field is really so important, well, I guess a week into it, we'd expect a lot of stores in California to see growing sales as customers flock into their stores instead of buying online. Well, don't hold your breath. That's not likely to be the case. People buy online for convenience, for choice, and for lower prices without even getting into the sales tax.
Is eBay, Mr. Del Bianco, in your view, an exception since it's often many used items?
Well, I would say that less than half of eBay is used items, and eBay doesn't actually sell anything. eBay is a platform, like a classified ads. It's a platform for other sellers, and it's a fabulous business platform for companies that would otherwise never reach that kind of an audience with their new or used items. And eBay is a California company, but eBay was only looking out for the interests of small sellers from around the United States who occasionally had California purchasers, right? Should a small Pennsylvania business that uses eBay to reach customers suddenly have to collect, remit, and file and face audits from California because it has a handful of California customers? Well, I'm glad that California said the answer to that was no. They had to be doing at least $1 million a year in California before they'd have to start look in the eyes of the challenges of collecting for that state.
Gary Griffith.
But if you had an eBay seller who reaches that limit, then they are required to collect.
If they are $1 million in California plus at least $10,000 a year that they spend with a California website or publisher, which would be the nexus to California,
Right.
since that California business would be in the eyes of the BOE, they'd be acting as their agent.
Okay.
I'd like to just take a moment, if it's okay, to get back to the idea of fairness. And fairness is a concept that ultimately is interpreted by the individual. And Steve posited it as that it's only fair because of the physical presence that the retailer has there. But certainly there's fairness when you have a marketplace, a country where there are very few limits to very few barriers to commerce, that all of the sellers are affected. And certainly, although people shop online or in stores for a variety of reasons, if you just looked at all the news articles coming out of California, you'd be hard-pressed to convince me that not paying tax wasn't one of them, because that was driving all of the reporting on this. And I find it hard to believe that the papers would cover it like that if there was in fact no interest on the part of consumers in purchasing tax-free.
If I could follow up on that, it's a great point of what the papers cover. But you can also learn a lot by watching what the most affected company is telling its Wall Street analysts, and pursuant to Securities and Exchange Commission rules. Amazon.com told analysts just last month, they probed them during their quarterly call and said, you're about to start collecting sales tax, 10% in California. Isn't that going to put a dent in your sales? After all, it's the 1/7 of the U.S. economy. It's the largest market for Amazon. The answer from Amazon was an unequivocal no. They've begun collecting in many states, and when they do, they don't see an appreciable hit to their sales, because it shows people aren't buying on Amazon to avoid sales tax. After all, they pay the shipping, they wait several days for the item to arrive, and they have to stand in line at the post office or UPS store if they want to return something. So it's really not about the savings of sales tax, and I think that if California businesses are looking for this to save them, they have another thing coming. The biggest threat to a small California retailer is the Walmarts and Targets and shopping malls, and it's really not the internet.
But in terms of fairness, and let's kind of take it to the small business, collecting sales tax seems to be a huge burden on you. Maybe some of your small businesses are going to be below some of the thresholds, but there's still going to be some of those that are relatively small. They've got a national presence because they're online. It seems very burdensome for them to have to try and figure out their sales tax liability for thousands of jurisdictions. Is it fair then to ask them, when they stand to lose money, that they nonetheless have to collect and remit sales tax?
You know, I think certainly there is obviously an administrative burden to collecting sales tax that all sellers that collect sales tax today face. And I think that's one of the important things about the congressional legislation, is making sure that the small business exception is set at a level so as not to burden those very small retailers. And that also the other simplifications in there are sufficient through not just the simplifications, but also provision of software that works, that those smaller and even mid-sized businesses don't pay any more than necessary to deal with the collection costs. But I think it's also important to note there are small sellers across the country who are supporting this legislation, including small eBay sellers. I mean, there are folks on both sides, even when you get down to the small business level. It's not as if it's monolithic, large business versus small business. You have small businesses on both sides of this, and you have large businesses. eBay has not been a fan of this legislation in the past, despite the fact that it doesn't sell anything. Many of its small sellers have come out publicly in favor of this legislation.
And you know, fairness is a big position of it is where you sit right now. Amazon, for instance, will be collecting for over half the U.S. population by 2014 because they have aggressively expanded their presence. Distribution centers. In California, they've got 2 distribution centers coming up to get same-day delivery. That means they're collecting in more and more places. And after a while, if you're already collecting for most of the country, you would probably take any little bit of simplification as a way to reduce your costs. And you also like the idea that it imposes new burdens on your competitors. So a lot of what Amazon has done by endorsing some sort of federal legislation is to shift burdens that it never had to bear before it became a $50 billion company. And Amazon at this point would love to see those burdens imposed on even the tiniest of its competitors.
Mm-hmm. Is there, in looking at the bills and with their differing thresholds, is there one that is better? I mean, do you have an opinion on what the threshold should be to define what a small business is?
You know, the Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board had done a study on what small businesses were spending out of their own pocket to collect sales tax for the states where they already collected. And they concluded it was about 17 cents for every dollar of tax they collected for businesses that were under $1 million a year in sales. And that kind of burden was foremost in the mind of trying to come up with a small seller exception. But over time, that number has whipped all over the map. I thought it's somewhat instructive, though, to take a look at just last year in the United States, based on the Internet Retailer Top 500, that the top 500 retailers here account for about 90% of the uncollected sales tax. So the states could potentially grab 90% of the sales tax that they want to collect and set that small seller exception at the number 500 seller. That's $15 million a year in sales. California set it at $1 million in sales just for California. If they're 1/7 of the national economy, let's see, $1 million times 7 is $7 million. So they've given the equivalent of a $7 million national exemption there.
Looking at that, the figure, the Washington study, and the streamlined sales tax study that came after it, I think it's helpful just to boil that down to real numbers, right? If you're selling then $1 million worth of good, let's say the sales tax rate's about 7%, you're collecting $70,000 in taxes, and if your costs are 17% of that, it's costing you about $10,000 a year, or 0.1% of your sales, to comply with sales tax collection. It's not an insignificant sum, nor is it insurmountable. One thing that I need to point out, there are actually two things. At least one of the bills sets the threshold at $1 million. And so when that study looks at sellers over $1 million, the costs drop quickly and significantly. The other thing I think that is important is that study was done before any of the simplifications that have been put in place by the streamlined states or that are contemplated in the federal bills were put in place. Presumably those simplifications, combined with the provision of software, will reduce those costs. Down to zero? No, but to a level where the burden is something that can be dealt with.
Steve Del Bianco and Joe Crosby, we've been talking about California quite a bit, but is there a state, in your view, that's done it well and done it right?
Many states maintain a single tax rate across the entire state. They don't allow the local cities and counties to add a mosquito abatement tax. They might even restrict states from having sales tax holidays, where between August 3rd and 5th, you don't pay any sales tax on the first $50 worth of school supplies. I mean, rules like that are what makes collecting sales tax across the country insanely complex. So my own state of Virginia has done a pretty good job at trying to be simple and be attractive to businesses. They exempt digital downloads from taxation to encourage that industry. And they're not members of the streamlined sales tax because they want to maintain a really what they call a business-friendly environment.
I think this highlights the balance I talked about earlier that Congress has to strike between the burdens on interstate commerce on the one hand and state sovereignty on the other. Many of those things that make the sales tax more complex are things that consumers and voters like. Sales tax holidays, caps and thresholds so that when you buy a car, you're not paying sales tax in some states on the full price. You pay it on a much reduced price. Those are things that consumers and voters like. And so it's a balance on one hand between those desires of the voters in the states and the desire for fairness, and also for the states, frankly, to be able to maintain their taxes in a way that makes sense, so that to the extent the taxes being imposed, that it's actually being collected. And a number of states have done things like California. I think all of them, you asked, is there a model? I think ultimately it's Congress that's the model, because there's only so much each individual state can do. There's no way for an individual state to impose its tax system on another state, nor can they solve the larger problem that the Supreme Court decided without congressional intervention.
Kara Griffith, next question.
Now, assuming in a perfect world that we had one of the bills enacted this year, how long would it likely take to get, presumably software still has to be developed and then implemented, any sense of how long that would take? I mean, are we looking at like a 5-year down the road that we're starting to collect, or would it actually be next year and we would roll it out relatively quickly?
Some of the legislation in Congress it requires such trivial things for the states to do that many of them would begin to demand tax collection immediately. Okay. And it would certainly not take years. After all, the software vendors are eager to get paid to come in and implement systems to cover them. I think a bigger question is not just how long it would take, but how much would it bring in. Some of the numbers that we've heard are exorbitant exaggerations. I use just the Commerce Department numbers, and the most this could be is about $12 billion nationwide of new tax revenue. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's over 50 states. And remember, this $12 billion represents just about half of 1% of total state and local tax revenue. This isn't the silver bullet that's going to save the states from their fiscal woes.
certainly the revenues from this won't save the states from their fiscal woes. The revenue from any one tax isn't going to solve them, but they all certainly would be happy to have that money coming in on legally owed taxes that aren't being collected today. And then the other thing is that this is not simply about revenue. Obviously, it's about fairness. Now, Steve, if I remember correctly, in putting those numbers together, you looked at only business-to-consumer sales.
That's right.
So 93% of internet commerce is business-to-business, not business-to-consumer. There is a substantially higher level of use tax compliance with business sales, but it's nowhere near 100%. So I think Steve's $12 billion number probably understates it because it excludes 97% of e-commerce, a significant percentage of which is getting collected, but certainly not all of it. Not a base that is, what is that, 16 times more than B2C sales. Even a small uncollected amount can generate substantial additional revenue above the $12 billion that Steve articulated.
Okay. Now, in the more likely scenario that we don't have a bill passed this year, are we going to see more movement on streamlined sales tax?
Next year, it'll be back. It always comes back. The states are in a fiscal crunch. Streamlined sales tax has lost some of its steam and is badly in need of a reinvigoration. So I think it will come back next year. And after all, there's a lot of large companies willing to lobby to bring that bill back this year. And they're in alliance with tax collectors who'd like to see the extra revenue. So it will be back next year, and I hope that conversation drives straight in on the minimum simplifications, a single audit, simplification of rates, being able to challenge the states in court, in federal district court, if a state doesn't adhere to the minimum simplifications.
Are there any states that we should keep an eye on that where there could be further legislation or action?
I think, assuming that nothing happens in Congress this fall, that there'll be some action in the states. A lot of states have already done what they can and now really are relying on Congress. But I could see, potentially some action in Massachusetts and maybe Wisconsin and potentially Michigan. And there's a few others, Pennsylvania, although they've already done some things on the regulatory side. But it will definitely, if it doesn't get enacted, it will come back. There's no doubt about that. And I think that the issues that the federal government is dealing with its own finances and the likely impact on state governments of the changes that the Congress is considering make this a very attractive thing to consider. If you're on the one hand going to reduce federal funds to the states, you should at least give the states the tools they need to collect the taxes that they're already imposing.
Joe Crosby is with the Retail Industry Leaders Association. Steve Del Bianco is with NetChoice, Executive Director. And Kara Griffith, our guest reporter, is with State Tax Notes, the legal editor. Thank you all for being on The Communicator.
Thank
Thank you, Peter.